Madam President, I rise today to honor the life of a dear friend and a former colleague of mine, Jerry Ellig. Some 2 weeks ago, at just 58 years old, Jerry passed away. Jerry and I met in June of 2001. We were both working in the George W. Bush administration. We were working together at the Federal Trade Commission. I had just been hired at all of 30 years old to run the policy planning office. Jerry was my deputy. I hadn't met Jerry. Our boss, Tim Muris, the chairman, had brought Jerry in beforehand. It's always a dangerous thing when somebody else hires your deputy. But in this case, Tim did me an enormous favor. Jerry was a colleague of Tim's from George Mason University, a PhD economist, a brilliant man, a lover of liberty. And Jerry and I, for the next 2 years, ran the policy planning office together, and we became dear friends. I don't know that I ever saw Jerry without a smile, without a twinkle in his eye. He always had a joyful spirit, a mischievous grin, and he believed in the power of truth. He became an economist because I think Jerry was born to be an economist. I have no doubt playing with his Legos as a child, he thought about supply and demand and price elasticity. And he believed in the power of free markets. One of the things that the Policy Planning Office did was something called competition advocacy. Now, the FTC's statutory mandate is to defend competition. There's some 75 PhD economists on the full-time staff at the FTC. And Jerry and I together, when various state legislatures or state regulatory bodies across the country were considering a particular bill that would have potentially anti-competitive effects, if those state legislatures or regulators asked for our input, the FTC would analyze the proposed bill. And we would file testimony, written testimony, oral testimony. Both Jerry and I testified multiple places. In fact, I went to my office and pulled out the binder of all the competition advocacy that we filed in our time together at the FTC. On topic after topic after topic. And you know, there are a lot of bad ideas that government considers, bad ideas that come from special pleaders, someone who will benefit, but the harm to consumers is usually diffuse, harder to see, and much greater. And what the FTC would do in competition advocacy is simply quantify the harm. Simply provide truth and light and sunshine. And it was incredible that when we would be asked to come in and present that testimony over and over and over again, the decision makers would choose not to adopt bad policies, simply when they understood through careful empirical analysis how that would hurt consumers. One area in particular that Jerry and I worked on quite a bit was e-commerce. We started an e-commerce task force. Now, this was 20 years ago. E-commerce was at a much more nascent stage 20 years ago than it is today. We examined 10 different industries, every one of which there were barriers to entry. The existing bricks and mortar suppliers would go to their state regulators and seek to erect barriers to entry to stop new e-commerce entrants from competing and driving down prices. Actually, much of the impetus for the entire e-commerce task force came from a white paper. And Madam President will be interested to know where this white paper came from. It was the Democratic Leadership Council, a centrist Democrat group that had written a white paper entitled Revenge of the Disintermediated. And it talked about all of these industries where e-commerce was benefiting consumers, but entrenched interests were fighting against it. And Jerry and I together at the FTC, we convened 3 days of public hearings, 10 different industries contact lenses, telemedicine, education, funerals and caskets, wine. And it was interesting, at the end of the hearings, we prepared a series of reports. Every single industry panel, all 10 of the ones who testified, at least one of the witnesses said some variant of the following. You know, I've looked at the anti-competitive restraints in these other 9 industries, and those are terrible. Those are clearly hurting consumers. But our industry is different. One of the industries we looked at that Jerry took a particular passion for was wine. There were at the time extensive restrictions on direct shipment of wine. Shipment across state lines, shipment to your home. It was heavily, heavily regulated, and the wholesalers did not want to see that change. We began studying and working on what would become a wine report. It's over 100 pages long of empirical study on what that was doing, and we concluded that for consumers it was driving up costs dramatically, not just a little bit, but dramatically. I'll tell you, Jerry took great joy in traveling through Northern Virginia, going to wineries, sampling the wine. I will say he enjoyed that process of it as well, but collecting empirical price data. At the time, numerous arguments were raised as to why you should not allow the direct shipping of wine. One was that it would lead to minors drinking too much. I have to admit, Jerry and I laughed about that because I don't know that I've ever known a 15-year-old who wanted a nice, perky Chardonnay. If you were dealing with home keg deliveries, that, I will concede, would raise an issue. But wine connoisseurs does not match any teenagers I've known. But we decided, well, rather than argue about it theoretically, let's find out. And so we sent a letter to the alcohol control boards in each of the states that allowed direct shipment. And we asked them a very simple question. Have you seen any problem? Have you encountered any problems with underage drinking as a result of this policy? And lo and behold, they all wrote back and said, no, we haven't seen it at all. It hasn't produced any of that. All that came together in a report detailing the harm to consumers that came from these restrictions. And I'll tell you, just a couple of years later, the U.S. Supreme Court took up a case challenging those restrictions on the interstate sale of wine, striking them down, so that now you or I, if we want to order a bottle of wine for our home, we can go and do it on our phone and get it delivered at our home. And the Supreme Court decision striking that down cited that wine report that Jerry and I had done more than a dozen times. As I said, Jerry believed in the power of truth, the power of facts. Simply shining a light, this is hurting people. Jerry also took joy in that project. You know, Jerry was a fan of tiki cocktails and mixology, and all of Tiki Culture for that matter. He would proudly wear Hawaiian shirts, loud Hawaiian shirts, that his daughter Kat had picked out for him. And he'd wear them with the smile and joy he brought every day. He also made some of his own wine. For several years, Heidi and I enjoyed a bottle of cherry port that Jerry had made that he wasn't at risk of suddenly going into the winery business, but it was still nonetheless an enjoyable bottle of cherry port. Another project Jerry undertook at the FTC was examining education and school choice. And I sat down with Jerry and another PhD economist at the FTC, and we talked about school choice, and I asked the two of them, Jerry and Ken, I said, let's examine the arguments that are raised against school choice. And the most significant argument raised against school choice is that school choice will destroy the public schools, that it will harm the public schools if you give low-income kids access to scholarships. And we sat down and said, all right, let's treat that argument seriously. Let's not dismiss that out of hand. Let's treat it seriously, because if it were true, I would oppose school choice. That's a serious reason to oppose it. Let's find out if it's true. So Jerry and Ken, as economists are wont to do, they framed the problem more broadly. They said, what is the impact in a regulated monopoly or oligopoly when competition is introduced? And in particular, what is the impact on quality for the customers who remain with the incumbent providers? Not the folks who go to the new entrant, but the customers that just remain with the incumbent provider. They went through and they examined multiple other industries that had been regulated monopolies or oligopolies, and for which there were abundant data. They looked at telecom, they looked at airlines, they looked at surface freight transportation. And as they detailed, in each instance when competition came in, quality went up. Competition was good. They then examined every empirical study that had been done to date of school choice programs that had been implemented across the country. And they found that, unsurprisingly, again, competition was good, something we've seen in the 2 decades since, that when kids get options and competition is brought in and scholarships are available, that the quality of education in struggling public schools gets better and better and better. That article was published, Competition and Quality in Deregulated Industries, Lessons for the Education Debate. It's another example of how Jerry recognized that facts, that reason, can be powerful. When I left the FTC, Jerry went on to take over the Office of Policy Planning. He led that office of lawyers and economists who loved Jerry, loved his principle, loved his drive, loved his warmth, loved his humor. He was a professor for decades, beloved by his students. He spent decades at Mercatus studying regulations, studying the impact of overregulation, analyzing it. He just finished his tenure as the chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. He was a brilliant guy. You know, when he passed 2 weeks ago, an untimely death, talented economists from government and the academy, they mourned Jerry, writing touching words in Discourse magazine published by the Mercatus Center. Ajit Pai, the chairman of the FCC, for whom Jerry worked as chief economist, wrote that he would always remember Jerry's warm smile. Quote, Jerry would always start off the conversation with a warm smile which put everyone at ease. He would then explain in a collegial tone how he thought we should proceed, wisdom that always informed our ultimate decisions. Smiling and speaking gently are small things, perhaps. But at a time when the currency of public policy discourse is too often pounding the table, Jerry's approach was memorable. He loved his work. He loved economics. He loved free markets. And he loved his family. Jerry was blessed to have an incredible wife, Sandy, who was a dear friend as well. Their daughter, Kat, whom they adore. An incredible, loving, fun family. You know, when they were on road trips, Jerry would eat grilled cheese sandwiches made by his daughter in a toaster oven in the car because he loved Kat so much. Jerry, like myself, was also a big fan of the movie The Princess Bride. Jerry's death so early is inconceivable. God bless the memory of Dr. Jerry Ellig. God bless the Ellig family. In heaven, The lion lies down with the lamb. And Jerry, may there be no transaction costs. And may the Coase theorem always fully operate. We love you and we miss you, Jerry. God bless you. I yield the floor.